They say that hate is a strong word, and I agree. It's not a word that I use lightly. And yet, there is one Pokemon that I can truly say, without reservations, that I hate. And it's the strongest Pokemon that Game Freak has ever created, Xerneas. Let's address the elephant in the room, okay? There's another Pokemon that I am known for hating, and it's one that is also commonly considered the best ever made. But best and strongest are two different things. And between you and me, compared to how I feel about Xerneas, I don't actually hate Incineroar. Yveltal might be the harbinger of death, but compared to Xerneas, he looks like a harmless little puppy. If these two legendaries knocked on my door, I'm welcoming the bird in for a nice home-cooked meal and leaving the deer out in the cold. And the thing is, I'm not the only one who feels this way about Xerneas. When I say that Xerneas is the most unfair Pokemon ever designed, I'm not shouting about some conspiracy theory I've cooked up. I'm the voice of the people. A people, in this case meaning competitive players, who also hate Xerneas. Every competitive player's list of most hated Pokemon looks a little bit different, but I know that there are a lot of competitive players who have this legendary mascot sitting in that unenviable top spot. There are very few Pokemon more reviled, more feared, and unfortunately, more begrudgingly respected, because if you didn't respect Xerneas, you were in for a world of hurt. But here's the thing, that hate that we all feel towards Xerneas is also its biggest weakness. Because despite being the strongest Pokemon of all time, the strongest Pokemon ever created, Xerneas has never won the Pokemon World Championships. And the reason why actually centers around that very hate that makes Xerneas so memorable. But in order to understand just what the heck I'm talking about, we first need to understand why this Pokemon was so hated in the first place. So what does Xerneas do other than incite horrible negative emotions? What is Xerneas? Wait, you're not Xerneas. Oh, you must be Alice, the brand new character from this video's sponsor, Zenless Zone Zero. Embrace the warm weather with Zenless Zone Zero's brand new version 2.1 update, featuring a brand new summer-themed event. Experience brand new game modes and a story with branching paths, and earn amazing new outfits for Wise and Belle. You'll be able to meet Alice, a new character from the band new Spook Shack faction. She's I don't know how to pronounce this word, Tsundere? Sundeer? Xerneas Groudon. Tsundere? She's a tsundere. Anyway, she's a cowardly noblewoman, but when her mind is made up, her determination is impossible to shake. She may be naive, but she will happily cut you down to preserve her family's honor. I hope that's how people describe me. Alice is a physical type anomaly and will boost your team to new heights. You can download Zenless Zone Zero at the link in the description to check out this new awesome update and claim great in-game rewards for yourself. Thanks again to Zenless Zone Zero for sponsoring this video. Now back to my friend with dry hair, I think. Xerneas is, like I said, one of the most unfair, stupidly broken, poorly designed Pokemon that I don't even know how they had it, Xerneas is, in my opinion, the strongest Pokemon ever made. That's why I put it in the title of this video. And there's some room for disagreement here. Like maybe you could argue that, I don't know, Zacian at full power was stronger, though I personally wouldn't agree. And maybe there's a couple other Pokemon that come to mind. But really what you can't disagree with is that Xerneas is the strongest fairy type ever made. And that fairy typing is a big part of what defines Xerneas. Fairy is already one of, if not the single best type in the game. It's got one of the best immunities around, a handful of useful resistances, and its only two weaknesses are relegated to types that are otherwise pretty mediocre offensively. Types that are known for their defensive attributes rather than their offensive ones. Offensively, it's only resisted by 3 types, and when you're dealing with Xerneas, those resistances are the only thing keeping you from fairy type obliteration. Everything in Xerneas' kit pushes it towards abusing its typing. First and foremost, its ability, Fairy Aura. This is a very boring ability. All it does is boost all fairy type moves in the field by 1/3. Wait, all? Xerneas gets a free life orb on all of its fairy type moves without even taking any recoil damage? The only counter to Fairy Aura is fellow Gen 6 legendary Zygarde's ability, Aura Break, which turns that buff into a nerf. The problem is that this ability is tied to Zygarde, a Pokemon who would struggle anyway due to its lacking offenses, but especially because it's a dragon type Pokemon. It's weak to Xerneas. This isn't even talking about the fact that Zygarde has a much better ability called Power Construct, which if you're using Zygarde, it's like the only reason to use it. So yeah, it doesn't actually work as a counter to Xerneas in reality. If I were forced to name a weakness that Xerneas has, it would be the fairly limited attacking move pool, where it struggles for coverage moves if you're not looking for a fairy type attack. However, this is only a weakness in theory because Xerneas doesn't actually need any coverage moves. Instead, it can just spam the broken fairy type moves at its disposal, like Moonblast and Dazzling Gleam. Moonblast is one of the strongest attacks in the game, having no drawbacks to using it, a huge chance for a useful secondary effect, and higher base power than other similar moves. Dazzling Gleam hits both your opponent's Pokemon, and despite not being that strong, well, actually, we'll get there. Don't forget about Xerneas' overpowered signature ability, boosting these already decently strong moves even more. But of course, none of this is actually what makes Xerneas so problematic. Like a strong fairy type attacker, yeah, it's like not, it's not bad, but I mean, competing with like, I don't know, Primal Groudon, Mega Rayquaza, like surely it doesn't compare to those just with the fact that it's a fairy type attacker, right? That it's basically Gardevoir on steroids. The thing is, of course, that we haven't talked about what makes Xerneas so broken. The number one reason why Xerneas took over the game, and the reason why it is the single strongest Pokemon of all time, revolves entirely around its unique signature move. A move so strong that it threatened to ruin competitive Pokemon. I'm talking, of course, about Geomancy. This move lets Xerneas absorb Life Force, boosting all of its special attack, special defense, and speed by 2 stages. One move to boost 3 of your stats by 2 stages. You heard that right. Okay, think about it this way. One of the best moves in the entire game is Quiver Dance, a move that raises these 3 stats by 1 stage. This move is so good that it basically defined Volcarona for a while, a Pokemon with way worse stats and typing than the box art legendary Xerneas. Now think about using 2 Quiver Dances for the price of 1. It seems untenable. What was Game Freak thinking? Well, Geomancy has a catch. Rather than take 1 turn like Quiver Dance, it takes 2, a charging turn and then an activation turn. And now we understand why they thought this move was balanced. After all, this is basically 2 Quiver Dances over 2 turns, which is actually just worse than Quiver Dance, because like, with Quiver Dance, you can use it once and then stop. So I kind of get it. I kind of see what they were thinking. But there was an oversight, which is there is an item that allows charging moves to be used in 1 turn, not 2. An unassuming item intended to be used for moves like Solar Beam and Sky Attack and maybe Fly, but here would threaten to ruin the game. Power Herb. Without Power Herb, Xerneas is an herbivore. With it, it's the apex predator. In 1 turn, Xerneas boosts nearly every stat it cares about, doubling its speed, special bulk, and special attack. Another way to think about this is that Dondozo doubles these 3 stats as well as its attack and defense stat, but it has significantly worse stats than Xerneas. It doesn't get a boost in damage from its ability, and it has to combine with Tatsugiri, turning the battle into a 2 against 1 in order to do it. Xerneas is effectively getting these same boosts, except it starts out with way better stats, it has a way better ability, it doesn't get the defense boost that Dondozo gets, but it also doesn't force you to play 1 against 2 until your Pokemon is knocked out. And because Xerneas is so much stronger than Dondozo, and because it's getting this extra boost from Fairy Aura, nearly anything that doesn't resist Fairy is going to get KO'd in 1 single Moonblast. And even the Pokemon who do resist are most of the time going to be KO'd in 2 shots. In other words, for most Pokemon that resist Moonblast, you actually can't switch into Xerneas. Like, you can switch it and take the first Moonblast, but because it's doubled its speed, it then gets to attack again, and then you get knocked out. But let's say your Poison type is already on the field, and you tank that Moonblast. Good job. The thing is, you might not even be able to threaten that much damage back because Xerneas is also doubling its special bulk. And if you can't KO quickly, it can just continue to click Dazzling Gleam or Moonblast again on the next turn and take over the game. The short version of this is basically, if you give Xerneas 1 free turn, your odds of losing the game are astronomically high. Xerneas' very presence warped the entire game around that 1 setup turn. When Xerneas was on the field, everything became about Geomancy. And when it wasn't, everyone should be asking, where is Xerneas? One thing common when Xerneas was legal is that oftentimes players would lose because they knocked out their opponent's Pokemon at the wrong time. Giving Xerneas a free switch-in to replace a fainted partner when it wasn't threatened allowed it to Geomancy, and if it set up for free, it was often too much to stop. Because of the power it could gain from just 1 turn, Xerneas introduced incredibly high-risk mind games with its partner Pokemon, such as Amoonguss, Mega Kangaskhan, and Smeargle. Go all in on stopping Xerneas, and you might eat feed a spore or a dark void while it protects. Leave it to its own devices and you could lose the game on the spot. And trying to cover for both your opponent's threats was often impossible. How do you deal with Follow Me or Fake Out plus Geomancy? But if Kangaskhan doubled its attack with Power Up Punch while you tried to cover for Geomancy and doubled into a Protect? Even if you were somehow able to deal with a boosted Xerneas, you would still then have to follow up with its partners. And dealing with Xerneas in the first place was difficult because those partner Pokemon would continue supporting it the entire time. Follow Me doesn't suddenly stop being active once Xerneas becomes a raid boss. Despite not normally running any supporting moves, Xerneas became an excellent facilitator just because of the pressure it exerted. Geomancy was so hard to deal with, so hard to stop from going up, that players started to just try to beat it after the fact. Players would run Red Card, Haze, Roar, Whirlwind, anything to try and nullify the boosts. And you know what? It still didn't work. Players would try to explicitly counter Xerneas with their teams, but Xerneas didn't care. It won anyway. Geomancy actually isn't the only way to get a boost. You can also get one by clicking subscribe. It won't double your special defense, but it actually might increase the rate that your hair grows at. And honestly, I mean, which is more useful? Xerneas has only ever been available for 3 years of competitive play, and for 2 of them, it was the undisputed most important Pokemon in the game. In Japan, there's a city called Nara. It features a huge, beautiful park that's officially designated by the Japanese government as a place of scenic beauty. And I've been there, it is really pretty. But Nara is mostly known for something else: the deer. See, the deer that live in Nara Park are considered sacred. They roam the park freely, interact with visitors, and enjoy a happy life. Cute, right? Well, yeah, it is. Except there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of deer, and they know that they're sacred. You might think that they don't, but I swear they do, and I think if you've been there, you know that I'm telling the truth. These deer are bold. They're not like the skittish deer that I had growing up in my backyard. So the deer have no problems coming up to you and demanding food, fealty, money. They might even take a bite of your shorts. In short, it is a city, or at least a park, entirely run by deer. And that's what playing during the first year of Xerneas' reign felt like. Playing in a game totally run by the deer. In its debut season, 2016, Xerneas put up the most dominant performance of any Pokemon that we had ever seen. Before the format had even officially begun, players had already discovered the strength of Xerneas. In Japan, players had already found great partners for Xerneas at grassroots tournaments. And more specifically, they'd built a team called Big Six, the squad of 6 Pokemon that most often accompanied Xerneas on its way to the top. I made a whole other video talking about Big Six, which is the strongest Pokemon team of all time, but in this case, it's actually crucial that we don't talk just about Big Six, because yeah, that team might have reached unprecedented levels of dominance, and Xerneas was like a huge part of it, but Xerneas didn't rely only on Big Six to see success. From the very beginning of the format, you would see entire top 8s filled with Xerneas, and it wasn't being used only on Big Six. Primal Groudon provided the most obvious synergy with Xerneas' fairy typing, but the other team members were a little bit more flexible, and eventually even Groudon would change. Later in the format, players discovered that Xerneas and Mega Rayquaza had good synergy in a team composition called X-Ray. This team used Mega Rayquaza to help protect Xerneas from the powerful primal Pokemon, and it wasn't even the only restricted we saw paired with Xerneas, as we'd even see Xerneas Kyogre rise to prominence, making it to the quarterfinals of the World Championships. Xerneas, in all honesty, could work with pretty much any Pokemon because it was so strong. The main reason it was primarily paired with Primal Groudon is because it just happened to be tailor-made to remove the few weaknesses that Xerneas did have. Primal Groudon hits all of the fairy resists super effectively with its ground moves, and it also resists all of Xerneas' weaknesses while firing off the new signature move it got, Precipice Blades. Together, these two absolutely ran the game, fending off would-be counters with ease. And you might think that as the competitive meta developed, Xerneas would eventually fall off. And that really wasn't true. I really can't overstate how strong Xerneas was. Months after we started playing the format, you would still see top 8s entirely packed with Xerneas. This was a Pokemon that the entire scene was trying to beat, that players spent an entire year trying to solve, and still, after a year of effort, we couldn't keep it from showing up on half of the top 8 teams at both US Nationals and Worlds. Xerneas would return to the ban list for the next 2 years, when Sun and Moon released. However, in the final year of Generation 7, Xerneas would return once more, as if it never left. I would say that 2019 didn't feature quite the same level of deer infestation, in part because there were just more viable restricted Pokemon, but Xerneas still performed incredibly well throughout the entire year and was the main Pokemon to beat. 2019 was the first time that the Pokemon Company introduced the idea of series, which is what we have now. Basically, instead of changing every couple months, which is the current format, We used to play one format for the entire year, and in 2019 that 1 year was divided into 3 different formats called Sun, Moon, and Ultra series. Each subsequent series loosened the restrictions a little bit. Sun series started out with 2 restricted Pokemon but banned Mega Stones, Primal Reversion, and Z moves. Moon series added Z moves back into the mix, and finally Ultra series put everything back on the table. What did this mean for Xerneas? Well, in a word, it was perfect. The other top contenders of the format were really reliant on these gimmicks, like how Primal Reversion helped the Weather legendaries and Mega Evolution helped Rayquaza. But Xerneas, all it needed was the Power Herb, an item not banned in any of the series. I guess you could argue that the lack of Primal Groudon made things more difficult for Xerneas, but at the same time, Primal Groudon was one of the best Pokemon at resisting Xerneas because of its fire typing, so it kind of evened out. Xerneas did have some new threats to worry about though, mostly in the form of some new Steel-type Pokemon, like Kartana, Stakataka, Celesteela, Mega Metagross, and Solgaleo. Kyogre, Groudon, and Xerneas traded the top restricted spot throughout the year, but the thing is, a lot of the time, Kyogre and Groudon were winning with Xerneas. But Xerneas' new favorite partner wasn't a restricted Pokemon at all. It was something even better. The best Pokemon ever made, Incineroar. Incineroar might be one of the only Pokemon who could rival Primal Groudon for synergy with Xerneas. It had everything that you could ask for in a supporting Pokemon. Fake Out Pressure, the Intimidate ability to shore up Xerneas' weaker physical defense, which is also the one stat that doesn't get boosted by Geomancy, and this is a time before Clear Amulet existed, okay? And actually even the fire typing was super useful for these pesky steel types like Kartana. It also helped that Incineroar could pivot out and bring in other Pokemon safely, so you could really easily switch between Incineroar and Amoonguss without having to make any kind of crazy risky predictions. Xerneas would pick up another dozen or so regional wins over the course of the season, and despite what I said about its decreased dominance, it won 3 of the 4 international tournaments, which, for anyone unaware, is the biggest level of event outside of the World Championships. It was paired with Lunala in Latin America and Oceania, and with Rayquaza in Europe. The only international it fell short at was North American Internationals, thanks to the brave efforts of one soul, who channeled his hate for Xerneas and managed to somehow take home the gold. It's me, okay? The brave soul who stopped Xerneas was me. For the second time, actually, but we're getting to that, okay? Despite the fact that it didn't win North American Internationals, it's still Xerneas all the way down. Only 5 of the teams in the top 6 team didn't feature the deer. Feels like I'm in Nara all over again. The only year that Xerneas has been legal and hasn't taken over the game was its most recent appearance, during the final year of Sword and Shield 2022. In addition to not being a good Dynamax Pokemon, Game Freak deployed the targeted Xerneas removal weapon, otherwise known as Zacian, meaning that for once we could rest easy. But again, I'll get to that. Hopefully by this point, I've made it clear just how freakishly strong this Pokemon was, and how infuriating it was to play against. It's been 6 years since I've been personally victimized by Xerneas, but my hatred and my resentment feel just as fresh as they did 6 years ago. Oh, how I wish I could forget. 2 years of my life spent battling the stupid deer at every opportunity, watching it win tournament after tournament, entire seasons crushed under the weight of one move animation that is entirely too long. I wish I could forget, but I remember it like it was yesterday. 2016, having hope that people had figured out something before going into nationals, seeing Xerneas win again, seeing another Xerneas in the finals, going to Worlds, resigned to my fate, winning Worlds, beating Xerneas. Wait, what? Yeah, despite its power, despite its dominance, despite everything that I've said about it, when push came to shove in 2016, Xerneas' introduction year, it did not win the World Championships. I did. But of course, 2016 was only the first year that Xerneas was legal. In 2019, despite having the highest usage of any Pokemon not named Incineroar at 2019 Worlds, Xerneas didn't win the World Championships that year either. And this time, I can't say anything about my 32nd place finish having anything to do with stopping it. Despite being the strongest Pokemon ever created, Xerneas has never won the Pokemon World Championships. In fact, it's never even made it to the finals. How is that possible? If it's the strongest Pokemon ever, how come it didn't win? There's actually a pretty simple reason for this. The emotion we talked about at the beginning of this video, hate. Xerneas is so hated, so reviled, and above all, so strong that when you reach the biggest tournament of your life, you've got a very real incentive to make its life miserable. Now you might be thinking, wait, Wolf, earlier you said that Xerneas couldn't be counter-teamed, so like, I mean, what's going on here? But actually, I never said that it couldn't be counter-teamed. I just said that people's attempts to counter-team it didn't work. And that was true. Xerneas was too strong. But then people got better. Xerneas, as with any Pokemon, can be countered. The problem with attempts earlier was not that they couldn't stop Xerneas, it was that people failed to build a team that could both stop Xerneas and stand up to the rest of the field. A hard counter isn't really worth anything if it goes soft against every other team, and for most of the year, players were struggling to pull off that balancing act. But I can tell you firsthand, preparing for Worlds is a different kind of beast. This is the crowning tournament of the season, the one you pull out all the stops for. There's no longer any reason to keep cards close to your chest. The stakes of Worlds also make some players approach the tournament a bit differently. Ideally, you come up with a team that's both solid and has the right specific tools to handle the field. But that's not always the case. Some players, faced with the hardest tournament of the year, fall back on what's been working. Others make bold meta calls, higher risk, but oh so worth the payoff. And what I'm really getting to here is that if this is your last tournament of the year, the only tournament that matters for this format, and you've only got one last shot, you're gonna do everything in your power with all the experience you've gained over the course of the season, all the lessons you've learned to make sure that stupid deer doesn't win the world championships. Xerneas is the strongest Pokemon of all time, and ultimately that has been its undoing, because by virtue of its strength, Xerneas has had the biggest target painted on it of any Pokemon I've ever seen. More than Zacian, more than Calyrex Shadow, more than Urshifu, more than Incineroar. Xerneas was a Pokemon where if you didn't have the tools and team building, you literally would not be able to beat it. It demanded so much respect and so much attention that players built their entire teams around making sure they could stop it. And ultimately, despite the fact that it truly is so strong, the amount of Xerneas hate became too much and it eventually fell. The team that I won Worlds with is packed with anti-Xerneas technology. I had not one, but two Pokemon that I knew could consistently handle Xerneas and its partners, because as we know, solving for Xerneas isn't as simple as solving for just Xerneas. The first Pokemon was Mega Gengar with both Sludge Bomb and Taunt, a Fake Out immune poison type who could hit Xerneas before it got Geomancy up and could trap my opponents on the field, preventing them from repositioning their support Pokemon. Taunt was really great against Smeargle and Amoonguss, who really relied on their supporting moves to actually have an impact. The second Pokemon I used was Lumberry, Gyro Ball, Safeguard, Trick Room, Bronzong. In addition to being one of the only Pokemon in the format that could stand up to 2 Geomancy boosted Moonblasts, Bronzong could tank a Dark Void or a Spore, wake up thanks to the Lumberry, turn the speed around on Xerneas with Trick Room taking advantage of the fact that Xerneas had just doubled its speed, set up Safeguard to stop future Dark Voids, and do heavy damage back with Gyro Ball, which does more damage the faster the target is compared to the user, again abusing the fact that Xerneas is forced to double its speed with Geomancy. And the team that won in 2019 is a similar story. Naoto Mitsubishi, the world champion, packed a slow steel type of his own, this time Trick Room Stakataka, who fulfilled much of the same role that my Bronzong did. In addition, he ran a Primal Groudon that could tank Moonblasts, and a Lunala that packed 2 anti-Xerneas moves, Wide Guard for Dazzling Gleam, as well as Trick Room to mess with Geomancy. Scroll on down to the runner-up, Hirofumi Kimura. He's got the same Primal Groudon and a Trick Room Steel type, but this time it's his restricted Pokemon, Necrozma Duskmane, which is, technically Ultra Necrozma, but whatever, we don't need to get into that. On top of that, he turns Xerneas' old partner, Mega Kangaskhan, into its biggest nightmare by outfitting it with a move that we talked about way back at the beginning of this video, Roar. When I last mentioned Roar, it was to say that it frequently didn't work in beating Xerneas. And honestly, that's still true in a vacuum. Like if it's the only thing you have to beat Xerneas, it's probably not going to be enough. But Roar wasn't the only tool that he had to stop Xerneas. It was just one of many. With Primal Groudon's great matchup and Ultra Necrozma's great matchup, Roar was, I imagine, more of a tertiary threat, where with Primal Groudon's excellent typing matchup as well as Ultra Necrozma's excellent typing matchup, Hirofumi was a little bit less reliant on Kangaskhan to stop Xerneas, but having the option could be really nice. Roar on its own wasn't enough, but Roar in combination with these other great Pokemon was actually quite effective. I imagine Roar could also be used as a way to guarantee that Xerneas doesn't get boosted. Like maybe you're okay taking a Moonblast or a Dazzling Gleam as long as it means that Xerneas isn't setting up. I think the lesson here is that while I don't know for sure whether the players in the finals of the World Championships hate Xerneas as much as I do, you can tell from their team building that they certainly respect it. I think it is also worth noting that part of the reason Xerneas hasn't won the World Championships has to do with luck. Like Xerneas has only been legal for 3 World Championships, and for one of those, it had a vicious guard dog barring the way to the tournament. Its matchup versus Zacian and its interaction with Dynamax was so bad that it was like, borderline unplayable, I think. So effectively it only had 2 tournaments, and 2 tournaments is not that many chances. Xerneas came close to winning both of these tournaments, and it very well could have if things had gone a little differently. So why does this all matter? Well, for one thing, it reveals this interesting pattern in Pokemon where often the most dominant Pokemon of the season ends up faltering thanks to its status as public enemy number 1. We saw the same thing happen with Calyrex Shadow Rider last year. A Pokemon widely accepted as the strongest restricted Pokemon at the time ended up underperforming at the World Championships because people were so ready to handle it. And it's not like legendary Pokemon are the only times we've seen this happen. Mega Kangaskhan was the Pokemon to beat back in Worlds at 2014. It dominated the entire season going into the World Championships, and then at Worlds itself, its best placement was top 16. If you look through the history, there are more examples as well of other Pokemon that dominate an entire season and then fall short at Worlds. It's an illustration of how much of a Pokemon tournament comes down not just to understanding how the Pokemon operate, but how the people operate. Worlds winning teams don't just read the Pokemon, they read the players, anticipating the literal emotional state of the scene as a whole. The Xerneas phenomenon warps entire formats. In fact, it decides entire tournaments. When a Pokemon is super powerful and popular, Pokemon that are weaker generally but have a good matchup into it can really shine. There's no chance that Bronzong pops off the same way it did in 2016 if Xerneas isn't around. Likewise, Farigiraf, while it is a good Pokemon in its own right, owes a large amount of its popularity last year to its phenomenal matchup into Shadow Rider. Finally, the reason why Xerneas' failure at the World Championships is relevant is because I'm afraid that it might not be the case for much longer. The past 6 years have been nice. I feel like I've been healing from my hate thanks to the break from Xerneas. But that's in large part because we were spared the presence of Xerneas in Scarlet and Violet. And this is a really good thing, and not just because I personally hate Xerneas, but because I think that if Xerneas had been present, it would have been borderline unstoppable. While Dynamax didn't favor Xerneas, terrestrialization is handmade for it. Xerneas' only real abusable weakness is that its defensive typing is weak to steel. But if Xerneas could get around that at will, terrestrializing to, fire, I think it really truly might have been unstoppable. This isn't even talking about how it could use Terra Blast to get coverage for any single type in the game. And of course, this was just a hypothetical, like, oh, if Xerneas was added to Scarlet and Violet, it would have been bad. But I am personally worried that this if might become a when soon. Legends ZA is on the horizon. The first game set in Kalos in 12 years, since Xerneas first appeared to wreak havoc. And I think it's a fair bet to say that Xerneas is probably going to be in Legends ZA. But to be honest, that's not even the game that I'm really concerned about. After all, I mean, Legends Arceus didn't feature competitive play, so maybe I'll be safe. But no, the trailer that spurred fear in my heart was a different one. The announcement trailer for Pokemon Champions. Now, you might have seen Dondozo terrestrialized to water in front of Mega Charizard and thought, oh wow, cool, both Megas and terrestrialization in the same game. But when I saw this, dread seized my heart, because when you put these two games together, you are faced with the fact that Xerneas most likely is going to be in Champions, and it most likely will be able to terrestrialize. And if this happens, I don't know if there is any amount of hate that could stop Xerneas from trotting to its first World Championship victory. Only time will tell if my premonition comes true. So for now, join me in reveling in our small victory against Xerneas. Not that it's been vanquished, defeated forever, but that we have forestalled it for now. Because despite its status as my least favorite Pokemon of all time, as the strongest Pokemon to ever be playable in competitive play, it still hasn't won the World Championships. For now. Thanks for watching. If you like this video and you want to hear more about Xerneas' role on the strongest team of all time, you should check out the video I made talking about Big 6.